Hello everyone and welcome to .NET Core Central. Today in this video I'm going to cover basic topics of Entity Framework Core. So the couple of things that I'm going to cover is what is Entity Framework Core, and then creating an application with Entity Framework Core to retrieve data from SQL Server database. So first, what is Entity Framework Core? Entity Framework Core is the .NET Core version of Entity Framework. An Entity Framework is an ORM built for .NET. Entity Framework Core has a couple of advantages over Entity Framework. Number one, it is cross-platform by the virtue of built on top of .NET Core. And number two, it is highly extendable. And number three, it is much more lightweight compared to the Entity Framework. Now, to create an application to use Entity Framework, I'm going to have a console application in .NET Core. And I'm going to name it as entityframework.demo. Once the project is created, I'm going to add the reference to Entity Framework NuGet package. So for that, I'm going to search for Entity Framework. And I'm going to install the Entity Framework Core and Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. Now, during installation, I'm just going to install Entity Framework Core.SQL Server because it has dependency on the Entity Framework Relational, which has dependency on Entity Framework Core. So just installing these should do the work. So I'm going to install this. Once it is installed, now it's time to create a class to access the data. In terms of database, I'm going to use SQL Server, and I'm going to use this database time management, and the idea will be to use this table employee. So for that, first I'm going to create a model called employee. And in employee, I'm going to have ID, first name, last name, address, home phone, and cell phone. These 6 properties. Okay. Once I create this, the other thing I have to do is, since the name of my property is different than the name in the database table, I have to use attributes to declare that. First, I'll start with the table attribute. And then here, mainly for first name, last name, home phone, and cell phone, I will have to provide the associated database column name. So it's first name, first underscore name. Similarly, for last name, it is last underscore name. And home phone, it is home phone, and then for cell phone, it is cell phone. So I have the employee object created. The next thing I have to do is create the employee context. So whenever we have to access a data from the SQL Server database or any other database supported by Entity Framework, we have to create a database gateway. And the database gateway is essentially a class which derives from DB context. And it is essentially a database context which is created, which acts as a gateway to the database. So for that, first let's create an employee context. And I'm going to derive employee context from DB context. And then here I'm going to declare a property for exposing the employee object. And for that, the property will be of type dbSet. And I'm going to provide employee as my, what am I doing? Employee as the data set or DB set that has to be exposed. And I'm going to name this property as employees. And next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a constructor to accept the connection string. And then last but not the least, I have to let the Entity Framework Core know that I want to use SQL Server. So for that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to override the onConfiguring method. And in the onConfiguring method, I'm going to use the option builder. And here I'm going to say use SQL Server. And I'm going to provide the connection string which is needed for connecting to the SQL Server. So at this point, my DB context for employee is ready. Now I should be able to access the data from the database through this DB context. So for accessing the database or for accessing employee, just like I do usually, I create providers and repository classes for interacting with database. So here I'm going to create a class called employee provider. Which will implement an interface employee provider. And employee provider will have, let's say it just has one function get, and it takes an employee ID as a parameter and returns an employee. So here I'll come and I'll implement the interface, and then the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a constructor. In the constructor I will expect or I will inject the employee context. And then in the get method, all I'm going to do is employee context dot employees dot where employee dot ID is equal to the ID passed. And I'm going to return this employee object. Yeah, so this will return the employee object. And then finally what I'm going to do is I'm going to go inside of the main method, and then let's get rid of this one. Let's create employee provider, and this takes a DB context, so a new employee context, and this is going to take the connection string, and then I'm going to get the employee from provider, and I'm going to pass ID as 1 because that's the only data I have in the database. And then finally I'll say console dot write line so welcome employee dot first name and then employee dot last name. And then let me quickly copy paste the connection string. Once I copied and pasted the connection string, now I'm going to run the application, and this should return me the name as in SQL Server, that is welcome John Doe, and we can see it returns welcome John Doe. So this is a very simple example of how to create an employee context deriving from DB context and then expose the employee DB set, and then using the employee DB set we can pretty much do everything. This is an example of provider. Just like provider, now we can create a employee repository which will be responsible for creating, updating and deleting an employee. So let's name it as I employee repo interface, and it can have create, which will take so it's going to take first name, last name, address, home phone and cell phone. That's the create method. And then we can have similarly update method, which will take an employee object and essentially update it. And lastly we can have delete method, which can take employee ID. So we have create, update and delete, these three methods. Now let's go and create a class called employee repo and implement this interface. Okay, and this class also I'm going to create a constructor and expect the employee context as a dependency to the class. And next what I'm going to do is for the create method I'm going to have employee context dot add, and here I'm going to create a new employee So this is the create method, and this should create an employee back to database. For delete method, all we have to do is employee context dot delete. And here, so for removing, I have to pass the employee object. So let me change the implementation here and take the same employee object. So this is, as you can see, it's pretty straightforward. And one thing I'm missing here is after I do the add, I have to do a employee context dot save changes. This is when the changes will be affected in the database. If we don't call the save changes, it is just not going to update the database. So the database update happens only when we call save changes in the employee context. And of course, same thing has to happen for the delete also. And then finally, I will implement the update method. So here we implemented the create, update, and delete method. Once this 3 method is created, the next thing I'm going to do is to go into program, and I'm going to make couple of changes here. So let's keep this as is. Let's get the employee context outside so that we can use it with the other repository also instead of just provider. So here can go here and say var so we can define the employee context on the top, and then here, just like provider, I can create a repo equal to new employee repo and pass the context object here, same context object. And then for creating the first, let's create an employee. So we can do repo dot create, and here we can say first name, last name, address 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10. Okay, so we can just generate pretty much junk here. So this should create an employee in the employee table. So first let's just run this code, and then we can check in the database if the employee is created, and then we can implement the update and delete. Okay, the code is executed. Let us execute this statement, and yes, we can see the first and last name, address, all these are created. Next thing we can do is we can now change the implementation, and then just do employee dot get here. Let's name it an employee 1, get by 2, and the next thing we can do is dot first name equal to new first, let's say, and then let's go do a repo dot update, and let's pass the employee 1. So we're changing the first name to a different name. And now let's run this program, and once we run this program, now what is going on? Should not take this much time. Should not take this much time. Let's see. Okay, it worked this time. I don't know what happened last time. So let's execute, and we can see that the first name has become new first, which is what we expect. And then finally what we are going to do is, we don't need this, we'll just say delete, and we'll delete the employee 1. Let's run this function now. And then we go here and execute, and we can see that the data is deleted from the database. So you can see it's pretty straightforward to implement, create, update, delete, as well as select using the entity framework. The only thing we are using is the DB context, and we're creating an employee context out of it. We are exposing the DB set here, and beyond that we are just dealing either with the DB set or the DB context. For all the add, edit, and update, the CRUD operation, we are just dealing with DB context, and we are doing add, remove, and update on the DB context and just calling the save changes to impact those changes into the database. And in case of the provider, which is the read function, we are just taking the DB set from the employee context object and implementing a link query on top of it to get the data. So that's all I wanted to cover today. But this is not all. Entity Framework also provides feature to use things like SQL query instead of it doing the SQL query internally, or using a store procedure. And also it has support for transaction. So in my next video, I'm going to cover how to use SQL query, store procedure, and transaction in Entity Framework. So this is all I had to cover today. Thanks so much for watching this. If you like this video, please give me a thumbs up. And if you are not subscribed to my channel, please subscribe it.